It was simply a wedding photograph. A bride and groom, positioned side by side in the year 1894. Their expressions frozen for eternity. On the surface, it appears to be a standard wedding portrait of that era. Formal, calm, unremarkable. But look closer. Direct your attention to her hands. The bride's hands reveal a narrative that words could never capture. Scars deep and deliberate, carved into her flesh. What became of this woman? Why is she pictured beside a man who, by every law and custom of the period, should never have been allowed to wed her? And why did someone conceal this image for more than 130 years? This is not merely a wedding photo. It is evidence. Evidence of something that was never meant to be witnessed. Evidence of a secret so perilous it could have cost them both their lives. Today, we finally uncover the truth. If narratives like this resonate with you, take a moment to subscribe and hit the like button, because what follows will alter your perspective on American history. The demolition team was scheduled for Monday. By Friday, the house would be reduced to rubble and memory. 11 years of legal disputes, unpaid taxes, and bureaucratic indifference had ultimately sealed its destiny. The Victorian mansion at the end of Oakwood Road in Natchez, Mississippi, once a symbol of affluence and southern grandeur, would soon vanish entirely. Helen first encountered the house on a humid afternoon in late August 2023. She served as a senior archivist for the Mississippi Department of Archives and History and had offered to lead the final documentation before demolition. It was standard procedure, the sort of work she had performed countless times before. Snap photos of the rooms, catalog any surviving artifacts, file the paperwork, and move on. Yet this house felt different. The instant she stepped onto the warped porch, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The odor of decay and age hung heavily, mingling with the distant sweetness of magnolia blossoms. Inside, the walls displayed water stains, and the floorboards groaned under her boots. Furniture lay overturned and shattered, abandoned by whoever had last inhabited the space, an elderly woman named Dorothy. According to county records, she had passed away alone in 2012, with no children, no siblings, and no one to claim her belongings. Helen moved systematically through the first floor, her camera clicking in the quiet. Parlor, dining room, kitchen, nothing noteworthy, just the typical remnants of a life concluded and forgotten. It was the attic that transformed everything. The staircase was narrow and hazardous, with several steps missing entirely. Helen climbed cautiously, her flashlight penetrating the darkness. The attic was cramped and stifling, the air thick with dust that made her eyes water. Broken furniture, stacks of moldy newspapers, a child's rocking horse with one leg absent. And in the far corner, partially concealed beneath a collapsed shelf, sat a small leather trunk. Helen knelt beside it. The leather had cracked and peeled with age, but the brass latches remained intact. She pried them open slowly, her fingers trembling with an inexplicable anticipation. Inside, wrapped in layers of fragile newspaper, dated 1932, was a photograph. She raised it into the light. A wedding portrait, a white man in a dark suit, a black woman in a simple white dress, with a date inscribed at the bottom, 1894. Helen's breath caught. Helen did not sleep that night. She sat at her desk in Jackson, the photograph propped against her computer monitor, unable to look away. The faces gazed back at her. The groom, his jaw set in quiet defiance. The bride, her chin raised, her eyes holding something that resembled triumph. But it was the hands that haunted her. Under her magnifying glass, the details became undeniable. The bride's hands, folded gently at her waist, bore a network of scars. Thick, ropey marks that crisscrossed her palms and encircled her wrists. These were not the result of accident or illness. They were the marks of bondage, of rope burns and shackles, of tools gripped until flesh tore, healed, and tore once more. Helen had examined photographs of formerly enslaved individuals. She recognized the patterns. But the Civil War had concluded in 1865, nearly 3 decades before this wedding portrait was taken. By 1894, the woman in this image should have been free. She should have been living without chains, without masters, without the brutal labor that left such permanent scars. So why did she still bear wounds that appeared fresh? The following morning, Helen contacted James, a historian at Howard University who specialized in post-Reconstruction Southern history. She sent him high-resolution scans of the photograph and waited. His response came within 2 hours. "Where did you find this?" She explained. "The abandoned house, the leather trunk, the newspaper wrapping dated 1932. "Helen," James said slowly, "I think I know what we're looking at. Those scars are consistent with something called debt peonage. After the war, many plantation owners employed legal maneuvers to keep black workers trapped on their land. Sharecropping contracts with impossible terms, fabricated debts that could never be repaid, vagrancy laws that criminalized unemployment. The workers were technically free, but they couldn't leave. They were beaten if they attempted escape. Some were worked to death." Helen looked at the photograph again. The bride's hands, the groom standing beside her. "But she married him," Helen said. "She married the son of her captors." "That's what we need to understand," James replied. "Who was she? Who was he? And how did they end up standing together in that photograph?" The quest for answers had commenced. The investigation began with property records. Helen spent the next 2 weeks immersed in the Natchez courthouse archives, pulling deed transfers, tax filings, and census records that extended back to before the Civil War. The Victorian house on Oakwood Road had been constructed in 1887 by a family that had moved from Virginia after the war. Before 1865, they had owned a sprawling cotton plantation and over 300 enslaved individuals. After emancipation, the family sold their Virginia land and relocated south to Mississippi, where they purchased new acreage and rebuilt their wealth through sharecropping. The patriarch, a stern man named Cornelius, managed the operation with an iron fist. His 3 sons oversaw the daily labor, collecting debts, enforcing contracts, and ensuring that the workers living on the land could never afford to depart. In the 1870 census, Helen discovered a list of laborers residing on the property. Among them was a girl named Eliza, 12 years old, listed as colored and employed as a domestic worker. By 1880, Eliza remained there. Now 22, still classified as a servant, still bound to the same family that had once owned her ancestors. But in the 1900 census, everything changed. Eliza was no longer listed as a servant. She appeared as the wife of Thomas, the youngest son of Cornelius. They had 2 children, a boy named Samuel and a girl named Grace, both classified as mulatto. Helen leaned back, her pulse racing. The bride in the photograph was Eliza. The groom was Thomas, and somehow, impossibly, they had married. They had started a family. They had defied every law and custom that should have destroyed them both. Yet the 1900 census was taken 6 years after the wedding photograph. What had occurred in between? How had this union survived in a world designed to crush it? Helen needed to locate the family's private papers. According to county records, the documents had been donated to the Natchez Historical Society in 1978 by a distant relative who wanted no association with the family's legacy. The papers had languished in storage ever since, untouched, and Helen made the call that afternoon. The Natchez Historical Society operated out of a converted antebellum home on Pearl Street. Its rooms were lined with shelves of deteriorating documents and forgotten artifacts. The curator, an elderly man named Walter, guided Helen to a basement storage room where 12 cardboard boxes sat stacked against the wall. Nobody's touched these in 40 years, Walter said. "Good luck." Helen began her work. The boxes contained a chaotic mix of personal letters, legal documents, business receipts, and family photographs. She organized them by date, photographing each page and constructing a timeline of the family's post-war activities. The letters revealed the daily operations of their sharecropping enterprise. Crop yields, equipment purchases, complaints about lazy workers. In the third box, she discovered what she was seeking: a bundle of labor contracts tied together with a faded ribbon. The contracts were printed forms with handwritten entries, names, dates, terms of employment. Each one followed the same pattern. A worker would sign an agreement to labor on the family's land in exchange for housing, food, and a share of the harvest. But the fine print told another story. The workers were charged for their tools, their lodging, their food, even the seeds they planted. Interest accrued monthly. If they failed to meet production quotas, penalties were added. If they attempted to leave before settling their debts, they could be arrested for breach of contract and imprisoned. It was slavery in everything but name. Among the contracts, Helen found Eliza's, dated 1867, when she was just 9 years old. The document listed her as the property of the estate, not as an enslaved person, since slavery was now illegal, but as a debtor. Her mother had died the previous year, still owing money to the family. Eliza had inherited the debt. She was bound to the land until it was repaid. Helen performed the math. Based on the interest rates and penalties outlined in the contract, Eliza's debt would have taken over a century to settle. She had been born into freedom and condemned to a lifetime of servitude. Thomas was different from his brothers. The letters in the archive painted a clear picture of family dynamics. The two older sons, William and Robert, were devoted to their father's vision. They managed the laborers with cruelty and efficiency, extracting maximum profit while keeping workers trapped in cycles of debt. They wrote casually about beatings, about punishments, about workers who had tried to flee and been dragged back in chains. Thomas, however, rarely appeared in the business correspondence. When he did, his tone was detached, almost reluctant. He seemed to have little interest in the family enterprise. Then Helen discovered a letter dated March 1891. It was addressed to a law firm in New Orleans, written in Thomas's handwriting. The subject was debt contracts and the legal mechanisms for releasing workers from their obligations. "I am seeking clarification," Thomas wrote. "Whether a debt holder may unilaterally forgive a debt without the consent of other family members who share ownership of the contract. The situation is delicate, and I require absolute discretion." Helen's hands trembled as she read. Thomas had been planning something. Over the subsequent months, according to the correspondence, Thomas consulted multiple attorneys across Louisiana and Mississippi. He was careful, methodical, always stressing the need for secrecy. His father and brothers could not know what he was doing. By late 1892, he had found his answer. Under Mississippi law, a debt holder could forgive a debt if they acquired sole ownership of the contract. Thomas would need to buy out his family's share, quietly, without arousing suspicion. In January 1893, Thomas made his move. He told his father he wanted to invest in a textile mill in Jackson and needed capital. Cornelius, pleased that his youngest son was finally displaying business ambition, agreed to give Thomas his inheritance early, including his share of the labor contracts. Among them was Eliza's. On February 14, 1893, Thomas signed a document that Helen found pressed between two unrelated letters. It was a certificate of debt forgiveness. Eliza was free. Freedom was only the beginning. In 1893, Eliza was 35 years old. She had spent her entire existence on the same land, working the same fields, serving the same family. She had never learned to read. She had never traveled beyond the county line. She had never known a single day without the weight of debt pressing down on her shoulders. And now Thomas was offering her something unthinkable. Helen found the next piece of the puzzle in a journal tucked beneath the labor contracts. It belonged to Thomas and covered the years 1892 to 1895. The entries were sparse but revealing. March 3, 1893. Told E that her debt is forgiven. She did not believe me at first. Showed her the document. She wept for an hour. April 12, 1893. E asked why I did this. I told her the truth. That I have watched her suffer since I was a boy. That I am ashamed of what my family has done. That I want to make it right. July 29, 1893. Father asked why E is no longer working in the fields. Told him she is ill. He does not suspect. William and Robert do not care enough to notice. November 15, 1893. E and I have spoken every day for months. I did not expect this. I did not plan for this. But I cannot deny what I feel. The journal entries grew more personal, more intimate. Thomas and Eliza had fallen in love. A love that could not exist in the world they inhabited. If anyone discovered them, Thomas would be disinherited. Eliza could be killed. But Thomas had made his choice. January 8, 1894. I asked E to marry me. She said yes. We both know what this means. We will have to leave. We will have to disappear. But I would rather live in exile with her than spend another day in my father's house. The wedding photograph was dated February 22, 1894. They had married in secret, beyond the reach of Thomas's family, and then they had vanished. For years, Helen had assumed that interracial marriages in 1894 Mississippi were simply impossible. The state's anti-miscegenation laws were among the harshest in the nation, carrying penalties of up to 10 years in prison for both parties. Any minister who performed such a ceremony could be fined and jailed. Any witness who failed to report it could be charged as an accessory. So how had Thomas and Eliza married? The answer came from an unexpected source. While researching the family's history, Helen had contacted descendants of Natchez' black community, hoping to find oral histories or family records that might mention Eliza. One of them, a retired schoolteacher named Cora, responded with startling information. My grandmother used to tell a story. Cora said, about a woman named Eliza who escaped from a plantation near here. She said Eliza was helped by a white man who loved her. They went north to a place where they could be married legally. Illinois. Helen checked the records. In 1894, Illinois was one of the few states that did not prohibit interracial marriage. The journey from Natchez to Illinois would have taken several days by train, passing through territory where Thomas and Eliza would have been in constant danger of discovery. But they had made it. Helen contacted the Cook County Archives in Chicago and requested a search for marriage records from February 1894. 3 weeks later, she received a digitized copy of a marriage certificate. Thomas and Eliza married on February 22, 1894, in Chicago, Illinois, witnessed by a minister named Reverend Abraham, who ran a church serving the city's black community. The photograph had been taken that same day. Thomas and Eliza had traveled over 700 miles to find a place where their love could be made legal. They had risked everything: imprisonment, violence, death, for a single piece of paper that declared them husband and wife. But the question remained: what happened next? Thomas and Eliza did not return to Mississippi. The 1900 census that Helen had found earlier listed them as residents of Adams County, Mississippi, with 2 children. But how had they come back? And how had they survived? The answer lay in the final pages of Thomas's journal. After the wedding, the couple had settled in Chicago, where Thomas found work as a bookkeeper and Eliza took in laundry. They lived in a small apartment on the South Side, surrounded by a community of black families and, Immigrants who asked no questions about the pale man with the southern accent and his dark-skinned wife. For 3 years they lived in peace. Then in 1897, word reached Thomas that his father had died. Cornelius had suffered a stroke and passed away without ever learning the truth about his youngest son. William, the eldest brother, had inherited the estate and the family business. Robert had moved to Texas. Thomas saw an opportunity. He wrote to William claiming that he had been living in Chicago for business reasons and wished to return home. He made no mention of Eliza or their marriage. William, who had never been close to Thomas, agreed to sell him a small parcel of land on the outskirts of the old family property, the same Victorian house where Helen would find the photograph over a century later. Thomas and Eliza moved back to Mississippi in 1898. It was a calculated risk. They lived quietly, avoiding contact with Thomas's remaining family. The local black community accepted Eliza as one of their own. The white community assumed Thomas was a reclusive bachelor with unusual household arrangements. Their children, Samuel and Grace, were raised in careful isolation, educated at home, protected from a world that would never accept them. The photograph remained hidden, locked in the leather trunk that Eliza kept beneath her bed. It was their secret, their proof, their promise. The fragile peace could not last forever. In 1904, a local newspaper published an article about miscegenation laws, calling for stricter enforcement against race mixing. The article included a list of suspected violators in the region. Thomas and Eliza were not named, but the threat was clear. That same year, Thomas's brother William made an unexpected visit. Helen found a description of the encounter in Thomas's journal. The final entry before the pages went blank. October 17, 1904. William came today. He knows. Someone told him about Eliza, about the children. He stood on my porch and called me a disgrace to our family's name. He said I had 48 hours to send Eliza and the children away, or he would report us to the sheriff. Thomas did not comply. Instead, he gathered every document that proved his family's crimes. The labor contracts, the debt records, the evidence of beatings and illegal imprisonment. He wrote a letter to a sympathetic newspaper editor in New Orleans detailing the system of debt peonage that had kept hundreds of black workers enslaved for decades after emancipation. He sent the letter on October 19, 1904. The response was immediate. Federal investigators, who had been quietly building cases against debt peonage operations across the South, descended on Adams County. William was arrested. The family's remaining properties were seized. The workers who had been trapped on the land for generations were finally truly free. Thomas was never charged. His cooperation with the investigation protected him and his family from prosecution, but the price was high. He was shunned by white society, his name erased from local histories, his contributions to the investigation buried and forgotten. He did not care. In his final letter to the New Orleans editor, Thomas wrote, "I have spent my life trying to repair what my family destroyed. I do not expect forgiveness. I only hope that my children will live in a world where love is not a crime." Helen finished her research in the spring of 2024. She had spent 8 months tracing the lives of Thomas and Eliza, piecing together fragments of their story from archives, census records, journals, and oral histories. What emerged was a portrait of extraordinary courage. Two people who had defied the most brutal systems of oppression their society could devise, armed with nothing but love and determination. Thomas died in 1923 at the age of 67. Eliza lived another 12 years, passing away in 1935. They were buried side by side in a small cemetery outside Natchez, their graves unmarked except for 2 simple stones bearing their first names. Their children, Samuel and Grace, grew up to lead quiet lives. Samuel became a carpenter. Grace worked as a seamstress. Neither ever married. Neither ever spoke publicly about their parents' story. The photograph remained in the leather trunk, passed down through generations until it reached Dorothy, Thomas and Eliza's great-granddaughter, who kept it hidden until her death. Helen understood why. For over a century, the story of Thomas and Eliza had been too dangerous to tell. It challenged the comfortable myths that white Southerners told themselves about the end of slavery. It exposed the brutal reality of debt peonage. It proved that love could exist across the color line, even when every law and custom conspired to make it impossible. But now, finally, the story could be told. Helen published her findings in a historical journal that fall. The article was picked up by national media. Historians and genealogists began searching for other hidden marriages, other buried photographs, other stories of resistance and love that had been erased from the official record. Cora, the retired schoolteacher who had shared her grandmother's story, traveled to Natchez to visit Thomas and Eliza's graves. She brought flowers and a copy of the wedding photograph, which she propped against the stones. "You deserved better," she said quietly. "But you made your own kind of justice." The scars on Eliza's hands had told the story of her suffering. But the photograph told a different story. A story of survival, of defiance, of a love that refused to be erased. And now the world would finally know.